After studying this module, you shall be able to know what Human Poverty Index, gender-related and inequality-adjusted indices are, learn how poverty, gender, and inequality can be captured in economic development indicators, identify which countries rank high or low in these aspects, evaluate economic development from the point of view of poverty, inequality, and women's issues aspects. Analyze aspects of economic development that GDP, PQLI, and even HDI cannot fully capture. The standard measures or indicators of economic development are nominal GDP per capita, PPP adjusted GDP per capita, PQLI, and HDI. The first two do not take account of aspects of economic development that cannot be quantified in money. The PQLI does try to take account of the material or physical aspects of life, but it has not been calculated in any kind of continued series. The HDI is a summary composite index that measures a country's average achievements in three basic aspects of human development: longevity, knowledge, and a decent standard of living. But there are aspects which even the HDI does not cover, such as poverty, gender, inequalities, and diversities among different countries. Because of this, supplementary and alternate measures of economic development have been evolving. Few suggested measures of economic development are the percentage of income originating from agriculture and GDP. The higher the income originating from agriculture, the less developed is the economy of a country. Per capita consumption of energy. The higher the per capita consumption of energy, the more developed is the industry and economy of the country. Percentage of starches in total calories consumed. If there is a high percentage of starches consumed in total calories consumed by the people, the economy will be considered as underdeveloped. Degree of urbanization, high school enrollment ratio. If the ratio of school enrollment, the degree of urbanization, and life expectancy is rising in a country, they are considered to be positively related to economic development. Infant mortality and density of population. If in a country the infant mortality and density of population are high, it is considered to be negatively related to economic development. Three most important new indices are Human Poverty Index, gender related measures, and inequality adjusted indices. Human Poverty Index. It looks at deprivations in the three basic dimensions: lack of a long and healthy life as measured by the probability of not surviving past the age of 40, exclusion from knowledge as measured by the adult literacy rate, and lack of a decent standard of living or lack of essential services as measured by the percentage of the population not using an improved water source and the percentage of children underweight for their age. It is derived separately for developing countries, HPI-1, and a group of select high-income OECD countries, HPI-2, to better reflect socio-economic differences and also the widely different measures of deprivation in the two groups. The HPI-1 for developing countries can be calculated by using the formula HPI-1 is equal to 1 upon 3 P alpha 1 plus P alpha 2 plus P alpha 3 raised to the power of 1 upon alpha, where P1 is the probability at birth of not surviving to age 40 times 100, P2 is the adult illiteracy rate, and P3 is the unweighted average of population without sustainable access to an improved water source and children underweight for age. Alpha is 3. The HPI-2 for developed countries can be calculated by using the formula HPI-2 is equal to 1 upon 4 P alpha 1 plus P alpha 2 plus P alpha 3 plus P alpha 4 raised to the power of 1 upon alpha. Here, P1 is the probability at birth of not surviving to age 60 times 100. P2 are the adults lacking functional literacy skills. P3 is the population below income poverty line, 50% of median adjusted household disposable income. And P4 is the rate of long term unemployment, lasting 12 months or more. Alpha is 3. Let's now discuss the difference between Human Poverty Index and Human Development Index. The Human Poverty Index (HPI) is quite similar to the HDI. The difference is the variables used, which again reflect the orientation of the two measures. The HDI looks at the positive signs of development, the HPI at the negative ones. A higher HDI indicates that the country has more of good things, an achievement. A lower HPI indicates that the country has less of bad things, a failure. While the HDI measures average achievement, the HPI measures deprivations in the three basic dimensions of human development captured in the HDI. The 2010 UNDP Global Human Development Report, The Real Wealth of Nations, Pathways to Human Development introduced a new index, the Inequality Adjusted HDI, aimed at capturing the distributional dimensions of human development. The Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index (IHDI) is a measure of the average level of human development of people in a society once inequality is taken into account. In this index, three dimensions of HDI, that is, income, education, and health, are adjusted for inequalities in attainments across people.
Till now, you have looked at what economic development is and how it can be quantified or measured. We are going on further with this idea of quantifying or measuring economic development. The standard measures or indicators of economic development are nominal GDP per capita, PPP adjusted GDP per capita, PQLI and HDI. Now you must remember what these are, which we have discussed earlier. Now the first two, that is economic development measured by nominal GDP per capita and PPP adjusted GDP, do not take account of certain other aspects of economic development that cannot be quantified in money. The PQLI, the Physical Quality of Life Index, does try to take account of such aspects, but is not very satisfactory or is not available in any continuous basis. The Human Development Index, however, HDI, is regularly calculated by a very established and respectable organization, the United Nations. The UNDP, United Nations Development Program, releases these HDI figures every year for all the countries which are a member of the UN. The HDI is a summary composite index measuring a country's average achievements in three basic aspects: longevity, knowledge, and a decent standard of living. Longevity as measured by life expectancy at birth, knowledge as measured by a combination of adult literacy rate and the combined primary, secondary, and tertiary gross enrollment ratio, and standard of living by the GDP per capita. Please remember these aspects, because these are the aspects which we will have to return to even when we look at the other measures. There are certain aspects which even this HDI, developed as it is, does not cover, such as poverty, inequalities, diversities, and so on. It is because of this that supplementary and alternate measures of economic development have been evolving. Some of them are the percentage of income originating from agriculture in GDP, or the per capita consumption of energy, even something strange like the percentage of starches in total calories consumed, and so on. But the most important, the most recognized of these measures are Human Poverty Index, gender related measures, and inequality adjusted indices. So now let me turn to the Human Poverty Index. Human development is seen as improvement, getting choices, having expanded freedoms, better standard of living, etc. Human poverty as a measure is a measurement of the deprivation of these things or the lack of these freedoms. The HPI looks at deprivations in the three basic dimensions captured in the Human Poverty Index. Lack of a long and healthy life, calculating the lack of a long and healthy life as measured by the probability of not surviving past the age of 40. Exclusion of knowledge, not how much knowledge, but how much you're getting deprived of it, as measured by the adult literacy rate, and the lack of decent standard of living, the lack of essential services, as measured by the percentage of population not using improved water source, percentage of children who are underweight for their age, and so on. Developed and less developed countries differ sociologically in their ways of deprivation. You see, what we consider enough for less developed countries is certainly not at all considered to be enough in the developed economy context. These are certain differences that do exist all over the world. To recognize this, to reflect this, in 1997, the UN complemented the HDI by this HPI, or Human Poverty Index, calculating it separately for developed countries and calculating it separately for some high income countries. In 2010, it was replaced by the multi-dimensional poverty index. So when it is calculated for developing countries, it is called HPI 1, and when it is calculated for a certain number of high income countries, it is called HPI 2, so as to reflect the socio-economic differences between these two kinds of countries. Brief look at the formula. The formula for HPI 1, that is for developing countries, is the third root of the sum of three different indices averaged over 3. What are these three? The probability of not surviving to age 40 when you are born, adult literacy rate, and then unweighted average of population without sustainable access to improved water source, and children who are underweight for their ages. The formula for HPI 2, that is the Human Poverty Index for developed countries, is developed in a similar way. It is the fourth root of the average of 4 different items divided by 4 because it's an average. One is the probability of birth not going up to age 60. Remember, in the earlier measure it is going up to age 40, which in an underdeveloped country that can be taken as a standard thing, but in a developed country it's not enough. Developed country, the expectation is that you should go up at least to age 60. So probability at birth of not surviving to age 60 is taken as the first item. Then adults lacking in functional literacy skills. Then third thing is population below the poverty line, adjusted for household disposable income and so on. And then the fourth thing that is mentioned is the rate of long-term unemployment lasting for 12 months or more. This Human Poverty Index is very similar to the HDI. The differences in the variables included, which again reflects the orientation of the two measures. The HDI looks at the positive signs of development, how much development has been achieved. The HPI looks at the negative ones. A higher HDI indicates that the country has more of good things. It's an achievement. But if it's HPI we are talking about, then a lower HPI is actually the better thing because it indicates that the country has less of the bad things. So that's the success. So these two, when we look at them, we don't look for higher values of HPI, we look for lower values of HPI, whereas in case of HDI we look at higher values of HDI. Thus, while the HDI measures average achievement, the HPI measures average shortfalls. Several countries have been sort of positioned or compared in respect of the HPI. Sweden has the best value in respect of HPI 2, which is 6.4%. The deprivation is so little. However, it must be remembered that you really can't compare countries of Africa with Sweden and so on. So as of now, Niger in Africa is the lowest of the HPI countries, HPI 1 countries, but it's not really logical to rank these two kinds of countries together. Nevertheless, they do indicate the degree of deprivation in the world all over. Next, we come to another aspect, that is the aspect of inequality. Inequality adjusted HDI are another developments that has taken place in this area. The 2010 UNDP report said that a new kind of index should be calculated. This is the inequality adjusted HDI. Remember, this is again an HDI. This is not an HPI, this is an HDI. The inequality adjusted human development index, IHDI, is a measure of the average level of human development of people in a society once inequality is taken into account, once it is corrected for. The three dimensions of HDI, that is income, education, health, are adjusted for inequalities in attainments across various sections of the people. According to the 2010 report, the IHDI is the actual level of human development adjusted for inequality. HDI simply should be taken as the potential human development. But what is the actual? The actual is when you adjust the HDI for inequalities and so get the IHDI. In respect of IHDI, India is ranked 119 out of 169 countries, and this indicates that inequality in India substantially reduces her position in the world ranking according to human development. How is this done, this adjustment? Very briefly, it uses an inequality measure which was suggested by Atkinson in 1970. Atkinson's measure of inequality is used, and every HDI dimension is multiplied by 1 minus AX, where AX is the Atkinson measure of that variable. The departure of the Atkinson measure from unity, that is what you multiply every HDI dimension by, and then you get the adjusted dimension. So these adjusted dimensions are then combined in order to get the composite IHDI. Now, it sometimes happens, and in fact that is the logical thing to happen, that countries with lower inequality adjusted measures score higher in their income index than other countries who have higher inequality adjusted measures. That is, you may have two countries with more or less similar national income levels or GDP levels and so on, but in one country the inequality is more. So that country naturally gets a lower ranking according to the inequality adjusted human development index. This is as it should be, so this is fine. This is what we want to be reflected in the IHDI. IHDI has certain positive factors also in its calculation. It does take into account that certain social groupings, however much you change them, it does not affect the measure. It is a good measure so far as statistics is concerned, but it is difficult to calculate again, because it is difficult to calculate inequality among the different countries and then to use it in a measure, it's even more complex. Now we come to quite another aspect, a very important aspect in today's world. This is the aspect of gender. Human development is in general taking account of men as well as women. But women's issues are very important these days. In fact, whether a country has developed or not is indicated by whether the women in that country have developed or not. So certain gender related indices have become very important these days. Gender related development index, GDI, gender empowerment measure, GEM, are measures which correct the human development index for its insensitivity to gender gaps. The HDI does not reflect gender gaps, so it is gender insensitive. But these measures, GDI and GEM, do take into account the fact that the women of a country are very, very important. The GDI is a composite indicator that measures the average achievement of population in the same dimensions as the HDI, while adjusting for gender inequalities in the level of achievement in three basic aspects of human development. Now, what about the GEM? The GEM also measures a similar thing. GEM really takes into account empowerment. The empowerment of women can be measured really through the political participation of the women, through the economic participation of the women, and women's power over economic resources. The GEM, for example, is a composite indicator of political participation, economic participation, and power over economic resources. For example, political participation is measured by women's and men's percentage shares in the parliamentary seats. Economic participation is measured by the women's and men's percentage shares of positions as legislators, officers, etc. Power over economic resources is measured by women's and men's estimated earned income, obviously in PPP US dollars. Somewhat of a critical look at the GEM. The GEM is valuable because it allows us to compare internationally certain dimensions that earlier was not there. For example, women's empowerment and so on. But it is a highly specialized measure and difficult to calculate and so on, especially because it relates only to developed countries. In India, for example, so difficult to calculate, whether the women have seats and how much land they own and how much income they own. Again, it is not fair that only participation in the parliament should be taken as a dimension of indication of economic power. People, let us say in the villages, who function in the rural panchayats, rural elections, rural leadership, even households, so far as income earning activities are concerned, somehow they should also be brought into the measure and not just participation in the parliament, which is a big thing. Women's empowerment is difficult to quantify, and therefore to capture them properly, it's not easy at all. Nevertheless, alternatives are even more difficult to calculate. There have been alternatives suggested, for example, a separate HDI for males and a separate HDI for female, a woman's empowerment matrix, a gender gap measure, but none of them have really been calculated on a continuous basis like the GEM or the GII and so on. So we have to make do with whatever exists as of now. There is of course a constant move to improve upon these measures in the UN itself. The average global loss in HDI due to inequality is about 22.9%. In Finland it is as low as 5.5, whereas in Angola it is 44%. So a lot of the development that is generated in the world is lost due to inequality. So the reflection of this is very important, and this income adjusted, inequality adjusted HDI does reflect this. In that sense, it is a very valuable measure. The Gender Development Index in India, for example, is also valuable because it shows how much India has developed over time. From in 1996, the GDI, the Gender Development Index, was 0.514 in India. It has gone up to 0.59 in 2006. So it does indicate progress, but not very substantial progress. These things have to be improved. In general, these gender related indices do show that about 60% of the women in the USA are engaged in economic activities, whereas in countries like India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, this figure is between 35 to 45% at the most. So in general, we would say that the Gender Development Index, the GEM, and all these measures do indicate that so far as women are concerned, the less developed world, the Oriental world are still lagging much behind the Western world, the advanced countries, USA, and so on. Nevertheless, as the UN Development Report of 2014 says, that according to income-based measures of poverty, 1.2 billion people live with $1.25 or even less every day. But if other dimensions are taken into account, almost 1.5 billion people in the 91 developing countries are living in poverty with overlapping deprivations in health, education, living standards. Poverty is declining overall, but people all the time, about 800 million people, are at the risk of falling back into poverty if these setbacks occur. Structural, life cycle, various types of vulnerabilities still plague the underdeveloped countries. So we do need to take account of these measures and calculate them continuously as best as we can, in spite of their many defects.
Let's now discuss a few observations based on IHDI. Effectively, countries with much lower inequality adjusted GNI will score higher in the income index than other countries who have higher inequality adjusted GNI but higher inequality. The IHDI is subgroup consistent. Improvements or deterioration within a certain group of society will be reflected in the changes in the overall measure of human development. The IHDI is path independent. The order in which data are aggregated across individuals or groups of individuals and across dimensions yields the same results. The IHDI is not association sensitive. It does not capture overlapping inequalities. That would have been possible only if all the data for each individual was available from a single survey source, which is not possible for many countries. The Gender Related Development Index (GDI) is a measure to correct the HDI for its insensitivity to gender gaps. The GDI is a composite indicator that measures the average achievement of a population in the same dimensions as the HDI, while adjusting for gender inequalities in the level of achievement in the three basic aspects of human development. It uses the same variables as the HDI, disaggregated by gender. It considers income in terms of actual rather than stated income. It can only be used in combination with the scores from the Human Development Index, but not on its own. Let us now discuss some critics of GDI. The data that is needed in order to calculate the GDI is not always readily available in many countries, making the measure very hard to calculate uniformly and internationally. Combining so many different developmental influences in one measurement may result in muddled results, and the GDI and the GEM may actually hide more than they reveal. The Gdi Life Expectancy section is adjusted to assume that women will live normally 5 years longer than men. This provision has been debated. The GDI considers income gaps in terms of actual earned income, but often men may make more money than women, yet their income may be shared. The GDI does not consider the value of care work as well as other work performed in the informal sector like cleaning, cooking, housework, childcare, etc. It does not, however, consider inequality among class, region, or race, but only gender. It is heavily dependent on GDP and GNP. For most countries, the earned income gap accounts for more than 90% of the gender penalty. Let's now discuss some other index, the Gender Inequality Index, GII. The GII is another measure that has been proposed in the Human Development Report 2010. It contains reference to other variables, viz., reproductive health, empowerment, and labor market participation. Separate male and female HDI. Economist Halis Akdar proposed in 1994 the calculation of separate male and female HDI. Gender gap measure. This is a measure of gender inequality which, instead of having to be compared to the Human Development Index, as the GDI is, would average the female male gaps in human development and use a gender gap in labor force participation instead of earned income. Gender Empowerment Measure GEM. It is a composite indicator that captures gender inequality in three key areas: political participation and decision making, as measured by women's and men's percentage shares of parliamentary seats; economic participation and decision making power, as measured by two indicators: women's and men's percentage shares of positions as legislatures, senior officials, and managers, and women's and men's percentage shares of professional and technical positions; power over economic resources as measured by women's and men's estimated earned income, PPP US dollar. Let's now have a critical look at GEM. The GEM is valuable because it allows to compare internationally certain dimensions that were previously difficult to compare between countries. But it is highly specialized and difficult to interpret, often misinterpreted, suffer from large data gaps, may not provide accurate comparisons across countries, and bring into one measure too many development factors. The GEM also has an elite bias, measuring inequality only among the most educated and economically advantaged women. As a result, the GEM is reliable only for very highly developed countries. The GEM is also felt to be too dependent on the income component of the measure. Let's now discuss some alternatives to the GEM: HDI for males and a separate one for females, a gender gap measure, a women's empowerment matrix considering six spheres: physical, socio cultural, religious, political, legal, and economic, as well as six levels: individual, household, community, state, regional, and global. A GEE including legal framework and protection of women's rights, as well as other important areas of women's empowerment that are overlooked by the GEM, example women's movements, public attitudes, and equal rights. Gender Inequality Index considering three new dimensions: reproductive health, empowerment, and labor market participation. Let's now compare some countries' experiences. The average global loss in HDI due to inequality is about 22.9%, ranging from 5.5% Finland to 44% Angola. Sub Saharan Africa suffers the largest losses due to inequality in all three dimensions, followed by South Asia and the Arab states and Latin America and the Caribbean. Sub Saharan Africa suffers the highest inequality in health, 36.6%, while South Asia has the highest inequality in education, 41.6%. The region of Arab states also has the highest inequality in education, 38%. Latin America and the Caribbean suffers the largest inequality in income, 36.3%. In general, The various gender related indices show that about 60% of women in the USA are engaged in economic activities, whereas in India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, this figure is between 35 to 45. In this module, we have learnt about some other measures of economics development that can be taken into account to analyze the development level of an economy. We have mainly focused on Human Poverty Index, Inequality, Adjusted Human Development Index, Gender Related Development Index, and Gender Employment Measures. HPI looks at the negative aspects of development and calculated separately for developed and less developed countries. The Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index (IHDI) is a measure of the average level of human development of people in a society once inequality is taken into account. The GEM is a composite indicator that captures gender inequality in three key areas related to power in hand of women.